I remember they did a study that one pathogen, like it was like a flu, it was a virus, I can't remember which one, was detected at the beginning of the day in one small part of a classroom. And this was a big classroom that they did the study in. Within 5 hours, the pathogen was on every single surface in the classroom. And the reason that I bring that up is not just to say your school environment or care environment is exposing your kids to, like, one kid has something, it's going to be exposure for sure, especially the younger they are, because they're just putting everything in their mouth and then their fingers are, touching everything in there.
Welcome to Biohacking with Brittany, where women optimize. I'm your host, Brittany Ford, holistic nutritionist and wellness entrepreneur, and I'm here to help you live in alignment with your body and nature. This podcast blends cutting-edge science with soul-led strategies to support you through every phase of womanhood, from fertility to longevity and everything in between. Each week, we dive into functional medicine, women's health, holistic healing, and biohacking tools that empower you to take control of your wellness journey. Let's redefine what it means to thrive together. Today, I am joined by the wonderful Ara Katz, who is the co-founder of Seed. This was such an incredible episode. I got to sit down and really just pick her brain about running a company while being a mother, her personal life, how it all intertwines together. And it was a really, really beautiful conversation. She is somebody I definitely look up to, who is running a very successful company now. I think everyone has kind of heard of Seed at this point. It is a probiotic company, a microbiome science company. And she really started it actually from this place of wanting to heal the microbiome when she was going through her pregnancies and having her babies. And so we kind of got into that and really got into parenting styles and kids' behavior and nutrition and microbiome. And it was a really beautiful conversation. And I learned a lot from her. And I take Seed every single day, the adult one. There is a kids formulation as well. And my husband also takes it. And I am actually so excited. We are actually doing a giveaway for Seed. So the giveaway will be launching shortly after this podcast episode comes out. So you could win one of the products for the adults, the kids, and the kids book, which is so cool. So I actually have the kids book, and it basically just like describes the microbiome and bacteria and probiotics and why they're important in a really easy way for kids to understand, with these like really beautiful graphics. And so she made that book for that very reason of like, hey, how do we start to have this discussion with our kids about our bodies? And what does it mean to eat food that supports the little microbes that are living in us? And so it's a really beautiful book, has to be on the shelf of every single family, in my opinion. And so you could win one. So go to my Instagram channel at BioHackingBrittany and enter to win. Strongly suggest you do that. It's great to just win something like this and really just set you up with the products and see how you feel and kind of go from there. But more than that, enjoy this podcast episode. I think everyone's going to get a lot out of it. And I just really felt honored to be able to sit down with Ara. She is someone who is just really cool, a really genuine woman from the inside out, and is running this successful company as a mom of two. And I just love sitting down with these like CEO mamas and like, basically being like, hey, how are you doing it? Teach me your ways. And we really got to kind of dig deep into that. Enjoy this episode. Thank you guys for listening. It means a lot to me. And a shout out to Peak. Peak is my go-to company for matcha. I love matcha, a ceremonial matcha, especially organic, very, very high quality. Really suggest you try it. I actually make this with my rainforest nut milk, which is what I'm calling it, or rainforest milk. This is a recipe that I've been playing around with because I've started making my own milk at home. And I guess I can say the recipe out loud or like online. I haven't really released it yet. But essentially, it is a combination of Brazil nuts, coconut, shredded coconut, cashew nuts, and hemp seeds. And there's a few other things in there that make it taste really yummy. But it's paleo, high fat, high protein, and very, very clean. I make it from home. Anyway, so I make this like matcha latte with my matcha from Peak, and it tastes fabulous. Use my discount code and my link, BIOHACKINGBRITTANY, and you can save. And same with Seed. I do have an affiliate link with them. If you guys want to subscribe, check them out, get their probiotic for yourself, for your kids. Strongly recommend it. You can use my link, and I think I have a discount code too. I'll take a look. And everything will be in the show notes for you. My website, biohackingbrittany.com. Thank you guys for listening, and I will catch you soon for another episode. Hello, welcome back to the show. Today, I am joined by Ara Katz, who is the visionary co-founder of Seed, a microbiome science company that's redefining what it means to be well from the inside out. If you've ever taken a probiotic, questioned if it's working, or wondered what your gut health is actually doing or has to do with you and your baby and your family, which we're going to dive into, this episode is for you. And I am so excited to kind of connect all of the dots in this space. So, Ara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to dive into women's health specifically in this space. I saw that you published a book for children on kind of like how to educate them about the microbiome. So why did you think that was important to kind of start kids young for understanding such a complex topic?
Actually, it's funny is that the book is called A Kid's Book About Your Microbiome. It's part of a beautiful series of books called The Kid's Book About from a media company called A Kid's Book About. And we actually did it during COVID, and when I wrote it, and it's so interesting because yes, I do. Of course, I wrote it for kids. It is a kid's book, but so many people have actually read it and said that they secretly, like now they understand the microbiome, and that actually it was so elusive to them, or they didn't like fully understand the word. So yes, it was intended for kids, but I think one of the things that it also was able to do was kind of simplify the microbiome for people. And so I always get like notes and stuff, people being like, I learned so much at bedtime. I didn't even want to admit to my child that I didn't understand this, but now I actually get it. So for me, and I bring up that I wrote it during COVID because of course, during COVID, we were experiencing so much misinformation, and we were also experiencing a polarization around science as well. A lot of people all of a sudden kind of becoming experts. And one of the things that we did during COVID was really, as a company, really double down on our belief in scientific communication and finding ways that people can hear you and hear about science in a way that doesn't, feel polarizing and also feels really empowering. And one of the things that, I think about this all the time for my own life is that, and of course, as I'm raising children, is that, the language that we use shapes so much of how they create their relationship to their bodies. And that includes the way we model our own behavior and what we eat, and of course, what we do for ourselves, our own health. But the language that we use, the words that we use, shape their entire experience and have a huge impact, later on in life. And I always bring up, in kind of one generation, I don't know how old you are, but, I grew up in more of the antibiotics generation. I grew up in a generation that you really like feared microbes. And it was a lot about like hygiene and sterility and cleaning. Everything needed to be hyper sanitized. And of course we took antibiotics like candy. And of course that's now a huge problem. And so it's so interesting how like in just one generation already, you have people saying, oh no, I don't want to take antibiotics. But that was not at all something that happened. And that comes from language shifts, that comes from starting to understand some of the advances in science, but also starting to kind of change the way we reframe these things. And so the kids book was my way. I always say to my team, you have to build doorways for people to walk through, and sometimes you have to meet people where they are. And the kids book for me was like that one expression of breaking it down, because microbiome is a word very similar to things that happened we saw during COVID, although not quite as charged like vaccines. The microbiome is a word that people fundamentally really don't understand. And so that's where it came from.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's so important. I'm curious what kind of language you use in your household to kind of foster a better understanding of the human body for your kids.
Yeah. I mean, I've always, I think children are talked down to in general. And I think that we really underestimate their intelligence. Um, my my 3-year-old told my 9-year-old yesterday that he was antagonizing him, and I was like, "Where did you learn that? Where did you get that word?" And I think we sometimes forget how capable and intelligent they are. And so I think as a first rule at a pretty high altitude, I've never not used the big words. So like if you ask my 9-year-old, he knows what a polyphenol is, and he knows that like, the compounds that are in like dark berries, or he understands fiber, he understands the microbiome, he understands these things, not because like he's a genius, but like, although he is pretty, pretty smart kid, but like it's because I normalized that language very, very early on. And I think one of the cool things, there's a term called superorganism, which is in the book. And organism is actually it sounds like it's a superhero or like a made up word, but it's actually a biological term for an organism that's made up of lots of organisms. And that's what we are actually. And I think when you try and turn the microbiome and, microbes, and, when you think about the fact that 50% of the cells in our body are not human, I have found the superhero kind of reference to be really helpful with kids. To say like you're a superorganism, like you have to help these, this kind of invisible world or force within you that keeps you work so hard to keep you healthy all day, to help them so that they can make you healthy, and so you can do all the things you want to do. And so I definitely, think about like fruits and vegetables and a lot of plant-based foods as like the the kind of feeding your superpower and making you like stronger in that way. And I think when you get out of like eat your vegetables, but get a little bit more into, oh, this is like what builds up this superpower that you have. Like it's such a cool framework for kids. And so those are a couple of things, but I think for the most part, I think the non-dumbing down of things is really important, and just trusting that they can actually kind of you sometimes have to say it a lot over time, but then they end up really ends up clicking and they end up getting it.
Yeah. I love that. It's like you're explaining the why. Like, why should you eat your
Exactly.
vegetables?
Which is kids' favorite word. A kid's favorite question. Everything is why. And so, when you understand the microbiome, you have a pretty good reason for why they should eat that stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
Also a really good reason for why they shouldn't eat other things, which I think is almost harder when you're saying like we're not going to have a lot of that, or
Yeah.
what does sugar do to our bodies? It's one thing to just say you can't have that has sugar in it. That doesn't, like, for a child, that doesn't, in some ways, depending on the age developmentally, that actually triggers the opposite response. And so I think, and look, every parent's guilty of this. You can't be perfect all the time, of course, but I think there's some cool ways to use the microbiome to kind of get you the desired food behavior that you want.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just think there's like education there that can happen. And not dumbing it down is
Yes.
hard because you want to make it like, you want to make it fun, like you're saying, like the superhero aspect, but you also want to like educate in a way that like empowers them to understand more and and like increase the vocabulary and all of these other things as well. So it's
Absolutely.
like that balance is actually kind of tricky.
Yeah, it is. And, look, I mean, this is like more than microbiome. It's more just like parenting and like how
Yeah.
I'm a big believer, like, when kids are, paradox of choice with kids is so challenging. Like, in my house, it's just not around, like the bad stuff's not around. So it's like, you're not having to, there's no denial, but that's modeling of like what should be in your home, what should be in your refrigerator, what should be in your pantry. And then there's rationale then for what you're using from that. I think where you get into trouble is when it's like always there. And like, somebody else is eating it and then you're explaining why you don't have to, which has nothing to do with microbiome. That's just kind of general.
Yeah.
And psychology. That's a tough thing for kids
Yeah.
to but the biggest thing is like what I care the most about is that when they're out in the world, they can make, kind of good choices. And that to me is not like, oh, be at a birthday party and deny yourself cake. That's like saying, hey, I ate a bunch of cake. I also see that there's like carrots and other stuff here. I'm going to add some fiber. If I'm going to have a piece of cake, I'm just add some fiber. Or like at dinner, I'm going to make really healthy choices because I already had like cake and pizza at the birthday party. So, it's not so much about like, being an extremist. I think it's, more just like intuitively empowering them to to find that kind of like right space, that right kind of
Yeah.
balance for themselves and their choices.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Even now when I'm making my son's meals, I even out loud, who knows how much he understands, but I tell him like, okay, we're going to have this sweet potato, but we're also going to have like lamb with it. And we're going to have like coconut yogurt and we're going to balance this carbohydrate with protein and fat because on every meal and every dish, we try to have all three. Um, and just like saying it out loud. And I hope one day that when he's older, he can kind of start to figure that out and make it on his own.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I think I really, I think so much. I mean, we can say all the things to our children at the end of the day. And there's so much research about this. It doesn't, unless you're doing it yourself, the kids are modeled from your behavior more than anything else you tell them,
Mm.
literally more than anything else you tell them. And so it really, that disconnect that you sometimes see in families where like the parents or the older siblings are doing something different than you're trying to get the younger. I think that's where a lot of like disconnect and, like they kind of can't reconcile it. But, if the whole family is eating that way, it becomes just like a intuitive, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I do think voiceover is an amazing way to instill that early. I mean, that's part of where the book, of course, where the book came from too.
Yeah. Recently, my body has been telling me something was off. My skin has kind of lost its natural glow, and no amount of water has helped to keep me hydrated. And my energy has really just been all over the place. Tired in the mornings, crashy in the afternoon, wired at night. Definitely doesn't help when you have a baby. Then I found Peak's Radiant Skin Duo, and let me tell you, it's been actually such a game changer. This is a doctor recommended duo backed by experts like Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. Will Cole, and it's designed to deeply hydrate and boost energy and support whole body wellness from the inside out. It low key has 15,000 5-star reviews, so I absolutely had to try it. And wow, within weeks, I have felt a difference. There is the Sun Goddess Matcha, which is my daily energy savior. Unlike coffee, which can leave me jittery and crashing, this gives me calm, sustained energy that lasts all day. It's packed with L-theanine for focus and EGCG antioxidants that really support firm, clear skin and gut health. Because let's be real, great skin starts in the gut. And then there are the BT Fountain electrolytes. And this is hydration on another level. I used to drink so much water and still feel dry and depleted by midday. And turns out my body just wasn't absorbing it properly. BT Fountain has clinically proven ceramides that actually lock in moisture at a cellular level, keeping my skin and my body hydrated from the inside out. And the glow, insane. I actually see a difference. Peak has such great purity as well. They go above and beyond with quadruple toxin screening, meaning they actually look at heavy metals, pesticides, and mold. And many, many companies don't do that. There's no artificial junk, no sugar, nothing like that. Just clean, science-backed hydration and energy. I feel more hydrated, more energized, and more like myself than I have in a long time. And there's no more waking up exhausted, no more feeling dull, dry skin, and no more energy crashes. If you want to feel like I feel and you want the glow as well, and you're tired of being depleted, I highly suggest checking out Peak. They have their offer, which is 20% off plus a free rechargeable frother. I love this. I use mine all the time, and a free glass beaker. So you can go to my link to get this, which is peaklife.com/biohacking. And this will get you the 20% off and the free starter kit. Do not sleep on this. Your body and your skin will thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, parents like model, they're role models, right? And they model the behavior. And even when I think back to like what I knew growing up, when it's in your household, you don't know anything else. Like you just think this is the norm and the whole world must do this because this is how we do this, which can be good and bad. But hopefully in this case, it is something that like fosters long-term healthy habits. And I know something else that you talk about is like when we talk about children's microbiome, you talk about this from a lifestyle aspect as well, and not just food. How do you see this playing out in your kids right now at the different ages that they're at?
I mean, I think it's, I think there's a few, things. I think, well, I mean, first and foremost, I think what we know about the gut-brain axis, and we know about children developmentally, and we know about the microbiome. And I'm maybe talking, let's say, more about kids once their microbiome is kind of been fairly well established, which is usually somewhere between 3 to 5 years old. Um, first of all, stress is like, I know like everyone, I could tell you all about fiber all day. I could tell you all about all the things that need to go in. I could say, use antibiotics indiscriminately. I could say you don't have to be obsessed with hygiene. Um, using really mild soaps and just doing like important parts showers, as as Dr. Becky Kennedy calls them. You don't. I think that a lot. Letting them play in dirt, and I think many of those things are fairly well recognized now, and certainly there's many more reasons to prioritize like plants and whole foods beyond just microbiome, although it's a huge part of it, and non-processed foods, but I think people also really underestimate the impact of stress on children. Um, and I think that is one that I don't think gets talked about enough. Although the others that I just mentioned are, of course, important. And just going back to the antibiotics, it's not just antibiotics. It's being really mindful of other just using medicines in general indiscriminately. And I think it's also, for all who are more naturally inclined. I use natural with large large quotation scientific perspective. Everyone's like, says I don't use antibiotics, and then they give their kids, buckets of oregano oil, and so these things are really all of them are really really strong antimicrobials. And so I would just say, and to the extent that you're killing microbes, I would just do it very thoughtfully. And then, of course, there's certain aspects of supplementation, either with probiotics and specific prebiotics, depending on what's going on with your child. We do have, from a GI and digestive health perspective, which I think is partially informed by some of the psychosomatic and stress things that I was just talking about. We do have a population where almost a third of children in the United States can't poop regularly. So, it's, intermittent constipation is a real thing. It's why we developed our kids probiotic, actually, why we did the clinical trial that we did. But it's also a very real thing. And that obviously is due to a confluence of factors, but, diet and I think stress being, two really big contributors.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually so interesting because when I think about kids being stressed, my first thought is like, what do you have to be stressed about?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what do you?
I think it's their response to the environment, and I think it's their
Yeah.
response to us. And I read a lot about, it's not a formal DSM diagnosis, but I've become really, I think sometimes when you name something and it becomes like almost like a pathology, I start to like be so attuned to it. And I remember when the first time I read about hurried child syndrome. And it's very interesting because, children experiencing being rushed has like really interesting long-term impact. And I just think about the impact of stress on what we feel as adults in our bodies. And I think when you then think about how that gets amplified when you're not the one also in control, and just and that's not just stress in a home. It means some things like negative, like there's a horrible toxic household. I think stress is information. And in some cases, you want the body somewhat stressed, right? You know that from a biohacking perspective, stress is a cold plunging, hot heat aspects of stress. But I think for a developing child, I think sometimes we diminish the impact of stress on things like the gut brain axis of our microbiome, which has been fairly well characterized. And I think does play a big role, even if you're doing all the things in terms of fiber and, probiotics.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that makes sense. I think there's like the physical environment that you are exposed to that could have toxins that are stressing your kid's health, like
Exactly.
we mold in the home that you don't know about. But I also think it could be like a family situation that is maybe not great. And you think the kid doesn't notice because the kid's only 4 years old or something and doesn't pick up when mom and dad are fighting every day. But I don't know, like maybe their cortisol levels say something different.
Yeah, I remember there was a paper a long time ago. I have to find it if you want to put it in the show notes, that showed that the microbiome can even change in a crowded elevator.
Wow.
Yeah, which is crazy. It's really interesting. And also, children, even just travel can impact or all of our microbiomes, but impacts the child's microbiome. So there's I think that it's not so much about like not doing anything to disrupt it. I think it's actually the opposite, which is building up a resilient ecology within your child, because throughout their life, they're going to be experienced to ups and downs and many different stressors, many of can't control, like things like mold, but also, other psychological, et cetera, stressors and toxins and compounds and sickness, et cetera. And I think it's not so much about, and I think you see this in developmental psych all the time, but what you want in a child is resilience. It's not like, it's not perfection.
Mhm. How do you I mean, we're really getting into parenting here, but, for you, are you into the whole gentle parenting movement? Like, do you think that is the best for the biology of children? Or
That's a great question. I can't cite research. I can cite my own anecdotal data, which is that, I think, I think as a society, we like to like codify things,
Yeah.
name them, and then cancel them. And then codify the next thing.
Yeah.
And then someone writes the bestseller about that thing, and then they go on a podcast tour to talk about that thing, and everyone's doing that thing, and then that thing gets canceled. And then everyone goes back, and then you see the article that says why gentle parenting is back. And like, so, I think we're ridiculous that way, um, as a species. However, I think there's aspects of gentle parenting that call on like things that I do believe in, family systems therapy and certainly other constructs and frameworks that do see the whole child. And I think that is important. However, I do think that I remember when I first heard this, and I can't remember who I was listening to. It was a paper that I went and followed up on. But the gentle parenting movement to me sometimes, and look, you have to like, the other thing about this is that you know your child, and everybody has such different circumstances and styles and personalities and things that they're bad at, as parents. It's not like somehow we're parents and we're like done growing and like we don't learn and get our ass kicked all the time about the work that we still need to do. However, um, I think that there was a quality of um, kindness and respect that gentle parenting talks about, that that does resonate. They've studied like tone of voice and impact on children, raising your voice, the impact of yelling, the modeling of that. So that in that sense, I actually just like the fact that sometimes those newer concepts, while I never agree with all of them, typically have like lessons. And I think we grew up in a yelling generation, like a yelling being normalized as parents. My parents yelled at me. That was very normalized. That I like. However, like the firmness and the like reinforcement of sometimes hierarchy and who's a grown up and like how that safe. And I remember just going back to the paper, I was talking about how I read about one of the most dangerous words for children is maybe.
Mm.
And which is so interesting because their brains just kind of can't, like, it's a no is almost healthier than a maybe for a child, even though they don't like it. And so I think that the rigidity of like yes and no, and the rigidity of knowing boundaries and like having structure, and like some of the ways that gentle parenting gets interpreted, I think sometimes makes that a bit softer. I find that the harder the lines, the better. Um, and at the same time, I also think from gentle parenting, what you get, and maybe this is from a microbiome perspective, interesting, is that you do, I think, get things about the frequency, like how it should feel to a child, that I do agree with. Um, and I don't think they need to be your partner, and I don't think it needs to be a thought partner and everything. And I don't think, but I do think there are beautiful uh, ideas that I certainly like appreciated, but I
Mm.
think there's a lot to be said about some more rigid structure and
Yeah.
clarity for kids.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a tough line, honestly. Yeah.
It really is, and it also depends like who I've also, different children, just like humans, it's like everyone talks about like biohacking, the future is personalization, and everyone talks about this personalized. And I think sometimes we forget that these frameworks are like they're just frameworks. It's sometimes people, every child is going to respond to something a bit different. And I think that's okay. I don't think,
Mhm.
as I said, I think we tend to name something and then shame it, name it and then shame it and then cancel it. And that, I think we drive ourselves a little bit crazy that way. I think, almost everything is a process of experimentation.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we do love to label everything. It's easier for us to understand, you know?
It's easier for us to trademark and then sell things.
There you go. Yeah. I'm curious if there's any data on daycare and its impact on the microbiome. I know there's data on its impact on cortisol and stress, but I'm curious if there's specific data on the microbiome or did it impact the microbiome through its impact on stress.
It's a really great question. Maybe I can come at it from like a little bit of a different perspective, which is I don't know, like in terms of gut brain and like psychological or like microbiome gut brain, like that I don't know about. I can tell you that your child's like care/school environment is an environment they spend a lot of time on. And I do remember a really interesting study, and this goes back to this is interesting for parents and for me. We know again a lot of this. I remember I read it during COVID, so it was particularly relevant. Which is that I remember they did a study that one pathogen, like it was like a flu, it was a virus. I can't remember which one was detected at the beginning of the day in one small part of a classroom, and this was a big classroom that they did the experiment in, or not the experiment that they did the study in. Within 5 hours, the pathogen was on every single surface in the classroom. And the reason that I bring that up is not just to say your child, your school environment or care environment is exposing your kids to like one kid has something, it's going to be exposure for sure. Especially the younger they are, because they're just putting everything in their mouth and then their fingers are, touching everything in
Yeah.
there, and they don't have their own desk spaces, etc. The second point of that I love from microbiome, is that I think that we're not very good at like community health in this culture in the United States. There are other cultures, like particularly in Asia, where you obviously saw masks way before COVID, where there's a lot more care and consideration for other people's health. And say I always like to bring that up, not because people are like, "Oh God, I'm not going to send my kid to school." I'm like, well, it's actually like not about you not getting your own child sick. It's actually another framework for thinking about when your own child is sick, what you're exposing every other child to. And many of them live with their grandparents, maybe. And so I kind of love understanding microbes or the invisible world that way, because it kind of calls on a little bit more of a collectivist mindset, which sounds very obvious, but it's, a lot of parents are like, a lot of people are like, "Oh, you're sick. You're going to school." And yes, of course you don't want a kid that's like kind of faking it and feels okay to like stay home, which I've experienced. But you also want to, it actually asks of you to consider more than just your home. And I think there's something, whenever my child stays home from school, I always very much make it, of course, about him getting better, feeling good. But we also talk about the fact that then doesn't expose other kids and the people that they might live with, their grandparents, their parents, their kid, their siblings, to what you have. And I think that just, it's just really small, subtle things, but I think it's a really nice thing that the microbiome and microbes kind of offer you, like maybe a little bit of more, I think maybe a little bit more of what the world, particularly the US needs right now, which is to kind of think of one another.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Um, do you think that a kid who goes to daycare or school, maybe I guess most kids go to school, but so we'll talk about daycare. Um, do you think a kid who goes to daycare has a more robust microbiome than a kid who stays home until the age of 3 or 4 when they actually are enrolled in a school?
It's a great question. They did. I mean, they did do some studies during COVID because kids were home,
Right.
and so they weren't exposed. And there wasn't it was interesting. There wasn't a lot of conclusions, although I'd have to go back and look at, all of them I remember at the time. But, and also kids were hand washing a lot more. There was a lot more, not only were they not exposed to one another, but they were also overly hygienic. So more hygienic than they normally would have been, which is interesting. And I think what I would say is absolutely if young children are going to any environment that's not your own, right? They're going to be exposed to, and their immune system is going to be primed by all kinds of microbes. So all the microbes that these kids are bringing from home, from their parents, from the cleaning products they use, from the foods that they're eating, basically all their whatever's on their skin, whether they have dogs or pets, for example, that all comes into the classroom. And then, of course, the caregivers themselves. The interesting thing is schools are often very well cleaned, and so sometimes probably with actually products, in my opinion, that are even too astringent. So it really often depends on like where you are in the world and what those policies are. But for sure, there's early priming that happens. I think it's a hard black and white thing to say because a lot of what you're asking depends on mode of birth. It depends on whether or not the child's being breastfed. It depends on their nutrition. It depends on whether or not they were exposed to antibiotics at an early age or are still being exposed to certain medicines and antibiotics. So it's a little bit, it'd be hard to answer it in black and white, but your instinct is correct, which is that they are going into an environment and assuming that they had a fairly healthy developmental period of their microbiome. They're then being exposed to, and their immune system's being quote unquote like primed or trained on lots of other microbes. On the other hand, you could argue that it may be being exposed to too many pathogens too early. And so there's some implications to that too. But at a very like theoretical level, it's obviously there's increased exposure, but there's lots of ways to do that, even if your child's not, healthily, even if your child's not in daycare. I mean, they get that at the playground, they get that by playing outside, they get that by just going to the grocery store with you,
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it would continue further to like kids who are homeschooled versus kids who aren't. Um,
very much, very much so.
yeah, and like what they're exposed to.
I mean, kids who go to school get sick more often. That's and during cold and flu season for the most. I mean, that's like a kind of a given.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just interesting to like balance I guess, like for such young kids, like the stress of it and what that can do to them going too early and being away from primary caregivers versus like also getting the benefits from being exposed to so many different microbes.
I would say I would never send a child to daycare to help train their immune system. That would not be a way that I would do it.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, and I say this with a lot of empathy or sympathy and empathy for, we are on a list of only 9 to 10 other countries, all of them third world and all of them tiny in this entire world. That is the only country that doesn't have paid maternal leave in this country, in this world. So, there are a lot of parents for whom there's no choice. And so I say all the things I can say, but at the end of the day, it's important to recognize our context, which is, science is one thing, but the reality of our current, systems and the way we support women, mothers, and parent and families in this country is quite fucked up.
Yeah. 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 It's hard to make the best choice for your baby's health or kid's health when like you don't really have a choice. Like you know what I mean? Like you're just like daycare's it. And especially as well, like we have moved away from such like family compound community living where people aren't even living close to grandparents or like really support anymore, that their only option is daycare outside of the home because everyone's kind of just way more isolated than what we used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also, I think, as I said, that's, yes, it's a big part of their waking day, but, a lot of it has to do with the way that you're setting them up for success outside of those hours too, and how resilient they can be in those environments.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to dive into C-sections a bit. And I've talked about this on my podcast before, and I had a C-section. It was not planned. And I'm curious what you have seen in your experience and your data of the babies who come from a C-section. What does this mean long-term for their health? Not just in the beginning of like, oh, your microbiome's not as great because you didn't come through the vaginal canal, but like long-term, what do we see here?
Yeah, it's, C-section, look, I mean, just let's start really zoomed out for 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are so many things that happen to women that are like codified with shame without like recognizing the nuance. So just to say, like, I saw you look down when you said I had a C-section, it's like it becomes a a real place of shame, of stress, and also in some cases like of unnecessary narratives around like what you did or didn't do, and that somehow there was a responsibility, or you could have done something different and had a different outcome. And so I think, I would just start by saying, I hope that as women, I'm also writing a book right now that kind of uses the microbiome, but starts to kind of hopefully untether us from the look down when we say these things, and more towards like the ownership of our stories. Because, the C-section thing has become a bit overblown because, and I say overblown in the sense that there's a lot of nuance. So like, I'll give you a great example. Rob Knight gives a good talk. I think he gives a TED talk about this. He's a really fairly well-known microbiome researcher from UCSD. And, he talks about, you can't really talk about C-sections, and maybe just for your audience and community, maybe just to frame it a little bit and just with some science. So a C-section baby is born and their microbiome at birth resembles more of the skin microbiome. You're going to see more species that reside on the mother's skin. And then, right, the challenge with C-sections is that very often the mother's given antibiotics sometimes, and the baby is sometimes given antibiotics. In a vaginal birth, the infant is bathed as they come through the birth canal with primarily lactobacillus, but specific microbes that have evolved to really be incredibly. We joke at Seed that it's like the original barrier cream. Hyaluronic acid. there's lactoferrin. All these things that, of course, you can now buy in very expensive serums and creams. And then there's lactobacillus in very specific species, depending on who the woman is. And, yes, that is quote unquote natural birth. There's a lot of reasons that those microbes and those compounds exist in the vagina, and they do offer a protective effect. However, what Rob Knight's work had shown was that, within, depending on the length of time and depending on whether or not an infant did not have antibiotics at birth, in the presence of breastfeeding, the infant that was born C-section and the infant's microbiome that was born vaginally start to converge and actually start to look very, 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 very similar. And so a lot of it, as I said, you have to kind of embrace the nuance, is that it depends on whether or not there was antibiotics, depends on the situation, depends how stressful the situation was. It depends on whether or not the infant is breastfed. It also then depends on what the nutrient source is if you're not breastfed. For example, like soy, I'll give you a good example, like soy-based formulas have phytoestrogens in them. And those phytoestrogens actually keep the lactobacilli in the baby, like a girl baby, a female baby's vagina alive longer, because it has more estrogen in it than goat milk, a goat-based formulas. There's nuance to some of this. In the presence of a fairly healthy C-section, which I like to reframe, and assuming that there was some aspect of breastfeeding and low antibiotic exposure, as I said, the microbiomes start to converge. Is it true that there are a lot of correlative studies that look at C-sections and then long-term health trajectories, and they see that there's quote unquote like dysbiosis, and it's highly correlated with autoimmune conditions, seasonal allergies, atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, inflammatory conditions?
Right.
Absolutely, yes. I don't want to underplay that. So you're right that is true. But there are so many other factors in early development. When solid food is introduced, what are those foods? Are there any other complications? Are there other medicines involved? Is the child exposed to nature? Do you have a dog? What is your environment? Is there mold? Is there not mold? There's so many other things. Once a child's in the world, there's so much exposure that also impacts that. So I wouldn't want it to say oh, you have a C-section baby, you're fucked. You can't make that leap, because that's not what the science says.
Yeah, I love that. I think you're spot on. And after my C-section, so he's still breastfed. We breastfed him right away. I did the vaginal seeding. I was actually told, and I don't know if you know anything about this, but I was told that the antibiotics that I was given for the surgery would take up to 12 minutes to cross through the placenta and into baby. So by the time like by the time they'd given me the antibiotics, the baby would be out because they have to do it so fast because it's such a big wound. You can't be open that long, right? So, because I talked to them and I said, hey, look, I don't know if I want to take these antibiotics. And the hospital thought I was nuts. So,
Yeah, well, yeah,
um,
yeah. I
yeah,
um th- there I don't know the amount of minutes. I can't speak to the amount of
yeah.
minutes. Um I can speak to the fact that, like, obviously antibiotic can penetrate breast milk, right? So there's transmission through breast milk and through
Mm.
breastfeeding. Part of the reason I waited, for example, for my second child to have the, I mean, a different reason, but similar to have the, like, vaccine in my third trimester was to have the highest chance of antibody, passing along the highest antibodies for COVID, because at that time there was no vaccine for children. But certainly there's some impact and there's some antibiotic exposure, but it's probably pretty low, through breast milk, for the most part. Um, but, it definitely, and it really, really, really depends, on what the antibiotic is, what the dose was, when it actually was given. At the end of the day, look, the most important thing with C-sections and with birth is that you have a healthy baby. Um, and of course, healthy is on a continuum, and some of the questions you're asking are, around some of the things related to, like, what these things do to the microbiome. But relatively speaking, there's so many things that can go wrong in a birth that if you can have a child come out healthily,
Oh my
um,
God, yeah.
these are things that you can kind of mitigate, um, with some of the other things we've been talking about, particularly as the child introduces
Mhm.
solid foods and you start to, like, interact with your environment more. I think the most important thing is that you have a healthy child. But and and there are, look, antibiotics in the right moment will save your life.
Yeah.
A
Yep.
full-blown infection, for a mother is also, you wouldn't be able to breastfeed, right? So there's,
Yeah.
you have to find the answer, and you are correct that the current traditional medical system in the United States knows absolutely nothing about the microbiome. So and knows nothing about nutrition and many other things that are maybe not new, well, in some cases newer. And that's not their fault. That's actually the way our system is set up. I think in the functional and alternative world, you start to see a little bit more. And then if we get into the vaginal microbiome, they know even less,
Mhm.
uh, than they do about the gut microbiome. And so your instinct was right. But those moments, you have to make a decision, and you also have to rely on things like considering what an infection would have meant.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's what's,
particularly in a hospital where you can get C. diff, I mean, there's many things that could have made that first period of time with your child far more challenging than the impact of that probably fairly low dose of antibiotics.
yeah, that's exactly what they said. Well, similar is like, you can get an infection from the actual cut in the wound, and then I wouldn't be able to breastfeed. And so, weighing the pros and cons, I was like, well, I want to be able to breastfeed for as long as I can. So, we're going to do these antibiotics for this short amount of time now. And I will just say a quick plug here. There's a company called Tiny Health. I don't know if you know them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They do breast milk microbiome profiling.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had my son's microbiome tested.
Yeah, the pooping.
Yeah, and mine and actually my husband's, we did a whole family microbiome
Oh, great.
panel,
Beautiful.
and I did his at 5 months because I wanted to check out his microbiome before we started solids,
Yeah.
if it had rebounded from, maybe antibiotics through breast milk, but also from the C-section, and his microbiome was actually really great.
Yeah.
So,
I'm not surprised. Yeah.
yeah.
It really speaks a little bit more towards, like, look, I think we love to make people scared. That's how we sell books. That's how we sell things. Um, and it's how bad information makes its way around the world. I think that for them, in most cases with healthy parents and healthy habits, like, you really end up seeing quite a bit of resilience in these ecologies of our bodies. And you are right to be concerned. And those are amazing questions to ask. And all the moments to raise your hand are the right ones. And we should, and as women, if we should advocate for our health and ask these questions wherever we can. But I also think that there's stress when you think there's also, don't diminish the fact that, you have to make the best decision at those moments with the best information you have.
Yeah.
Um, and very often everything's okay. And also if it's not manageable, and there's some answer, except of course for these rare moments where
Yeah.
there's a lot of things, of course, that we are, particularly more of the complex conditions and a lot of the autoimmune stuff that I think we're starting to understand a lot better. But are really challenging and do sometimes come from and are correlated with things like C-sections, but it's not an always thing.
Mhm.
I think that sometimes gets a little
Yeah.
hyper.
Yeah, it's almost, like, too easy to just point at one thing and be like, "Oh, this is the
Yeah.
reason why." Like,
And the truth is, it could be because you were living with mold in your apartment for 5 years and it had nothing to do with that, you know?
yeah, yeah. I'm curious for you looking back on your breastfeeding journeys and your birth with your 2 kids, knowing what you know now about health and wellness and microbiome, would you do anything differently with your level of expertise now?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I would. I really would. I hate to say I'm not a regretful person, so I don't think about it in a regretful way, but, I do. I think, both instances, I would have worked differently.
Hmm.
I was really building and then running seed during both of them, and I think that that impacted my ability to be present, both biologically, and in the way that I really probably would have liked to be. I think that there's like a little bit of just thinking of what I do and how I live moving forward that I can like take from that. I would say that with my second pregnancy, because I was running a company during COVID while I was pregnant, even though I'm always moving, I think I would have been moving more, and I would have. It was it was a really challenging thing for me to be pregnant, and during it was COVID, and then it's like I was. I think I was more a touch more sedentary, and also postpartum than I was with my first one, and I think that that had a lot to do with the fact that with COVID and other and particularly the seed was at a total. I mean, see, we were 200 people when that was happening, and versus like, 7 in a room as a startup in my first one. So I think there's some things around that that I would really like rethink. Um, it's not, I was, part of starting Seed was because I was so attuned to, what was happening. Um, Biologically and from a microbiome perspective, it's actually where seed came from. It's where our name came from, which seeding is, the process by which an infant first receives their first foundational microbes that kind of form their immune system and
Mhm.
I track. And so I think that, all the foods and things like that, I feel like I was doing the things that I understand and the science hasn't like shifted so much that I would necessarily do things totally differently in terms of food and supplementation. But I do think that in terms of around my work and stress and sleep, I think I would probably have shifted a few things. And there's one more that, like, has nothing to do with the microbiome and everything just to do with me, which is I, um, I think I would have documented a bit more.
Aw,
Yeah. I think that's one of the only, I would say, as I said, not a regret, but something I think a little bit about.
yeah. Aw. Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah.
Um, for those mamas listening who are kinda maybe feeling how you felt or feel right now, um, what words of advice would you give for them who are maybe building a company, but also trying to balance being a mom? Like, is there anything really there that I mean, is there even a way to do that
Yeah,
successfully?
I
I don't
mean,
know.
I hate the word balance. I think it's
Yeah.
a this, most like journalists or anytime like, like you're on a panel and like a guy is interviewing you, they're like, "How do you balance it and do it all?" I'm like, "That's such a guy question." It's such a guy question. It's like the answer is I'm fine. Of course I don't. Like there's no, balance. I mean, I think look, I think people can have like a good job and then they get maternity leave and they get paid for that and that's amazing. I've never had that because I've always had my own company. So for me, balance is I've never really like thought in terms of balance because the things that I've done feel so integral to me. I don't really see these. I think we create a tremendous amount of suffering when we split ourselves. I think women are amazing at splitting ourselves. So it's like you have your work life and you have your home life and you have your friend life. And I try and really not really find balance, but I try and find fluidity amongst those things because the truth is that you're gonna be breastfeeding your child, staring into their beautiful eyes and have an amazing idea. And
Yeah.
things will work. Like, like, that's okay. And I think we kind of like shame ourselves. We're like, oh, I'm not being present with my child. And I think that, women are creators. We create life, we create things. And I think the more that we deny ourselves like that fluidity, and the more we rigidly kind of think about balance. And, I think when people ask about balance, in some ways, I think they're really practically asking, how do you manage your calendar? Um, More than anything, I think it becomes a little bit about how you articulate time.
Mm.
That's what I have found about the question that people kind of mean, because I know that my brain, for example, does not split these things. I'll be at the end of a yoga class thinking about something beautiful I want to do with my child, and also having a new business idea. Like it's, I think that the more that, and you have to, like, the more you embrace that, the more creative you are, and the more depth and richness I think you get from your creativity. The more you spend time like creating pages in your notebook for like, this is work and this is this, like, I think in some ways, like, one of the beautiful things about women is that we are connectors too, and we connect disparate ideas and people. And I think we love to create things out of nothing, which we do with life. And mm, I sometimes think I try and hold the space for kind of like two things in my life, which is, one is that Carl Jung quote, which is, the greatest burden on a child is the unlived life of the parent.
Oh,
And so, I think a lot about that, right? Because women are amazing at denying themselves. And I don't want to be that. Um, I don't want my children to talk, going back to modeling eating vegetables, I don't want a child to grow up seeing someone deny themselves either. And I don't want a child to see me deny myself the opportunity to create things. And I think that we've become quite obsessed with quantity of time equals quality as well. And I think if you go back, even from an evolutionary perspective, or just in the quote unquote, it takes a village, um, there was fluidity in care. And yes, like, child care is different than passing it off to your aunt or your sister. It is different, right? Paying someone hourly, it's a transaction, it has a different tenor to it. And again, another place for women to suffer and find guilt and all these things. But I also think about what we were talking about earlier, which is like resilience in children. And I think that there's a way to be present in their life all the time. And that has to do with the quality of how you show up. That has to do with the quality of what you're like when you're with them. And I don't think that always has to be about quantity of time. And I don't think it has to be always the same thing all the time, which would then not create resilience. So if I travel for business, or I travel, like, I have just, and I think women just are, particularly in our society, prone to suffering and having these narratives about what something should be. I think Harvey Karp, who wrote Happiest Baby, who's like an old friend of mine, and who I met he's the founder of oh my gosh,
oh, Snow.
this new him and his wife Nina are so beautiful, such beautiful people. And Harvey always says, don't should on yourself. um I've really always kind of loved that.
Yeah.
So I take that whole question, and I question the question usually, and I think that, like, that's kind of how I deal with it. And that doesn't mean that I don't feel terribly guilty sometimes, but I also try and examine it, and I try and say, like, what's making me feel that way, and is that real? Like, when like, do my kids really feel disconnect? No, I run in, they like hug me, it's like, no, everything's actually okay.
Hmm.
you know and then there's moments where it's not okay, and that's okay. Not everything's okay all the time. And I think that, I think we, if not so much the gentle parenting, but if like Instagram parenting has done anything to us, it's like this idea that we should be thinking about these things all the time, and every interaction has to be like every perfect. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's actually then creating resilient children either.
Yeah. Or just causing more stress.
Yeah, exactly. Of what you think it should have looked like, what bedtime should have been. This is what it should have looked like. And
Yeah.
I think when I go back to what I said, what we talked about earlier, which is like, everything we do is just, we're modeling. You could say as many as amazing things you could process at bedtime. You can do gratitude this, and you can do all those things, and we do that, and they're beautiful. But at the end of the day, they're just learning what you do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so beautiful. Like, so beautiful and so needed for people to hear. I think there's something to be said about flowing, is like my word that I use. Because I used to really struggle with the context switching of like, having a podcast interview and then breastfeeding, then making dinner and then emails. And my brain would be like, whoa, this is a lot. But then after you kind of come out of the postpartum haze and you just do it again and again, you just kind of flow and it's so beautiful. It just, when you, yeah.
And you know what? Like I'm, we also have culturally, we've got it so wrong in the United States. Well, I know you're in Canada, but call it the West.
Yes.
Or like the US and Canada, maybe. In Northern Europe and in other places, like they've, you haven't experienced this yet because you have a younger child, but like, we've like wired ourselves to believe that we're like entertainment systems. There's just like, there's all this science to like the importance of kids being bored and like just being dragged to things they don't want to go to and just go on air. Like it's about your family. It's not about you, it's not about you. And so, in many ways, the way that the suffering we experience, it centers the child in the middle of everything, right? Because it says this child is not getting their needs met and I have to sacrifice this to get their need. And of course, there's a certain amount of being a parent of that where that's true, but it centers the child in a way that we've created, I think, a lot of unrealistic expectations for how it is when they go out in the world. And you see that, right? We have kids who are lonely. You see social media impact. You see where they're looking for external things to feed that or to reiterate that and to reiterate their centeredness and or their centralness to everything, which is, social media is the perfect mirror for that. And I think that I think a lot about, me and my husband have actually talked a lot about, when you look at some of these Northern European countries and places where happiness is like just like off the charts, and they just don't have the loneliness and depression and teenagers. These children are at the center of the fucking universe. There's something to be said about that. And so when I look at moms suffering, sometimes it is because we have put this child up here in the center, and then we've decided that we're consistently not meeting, the king's or queen's needs. And I think, as I said, of course, there's a beautiful part. You just want to be a great parent and you love your child. But I think there also is something to that flow, like you said, which is like, they're just part of the flow.
Yeah.
And by the way, it feels better for them too. It's a lot of pressure for them to be the center of everything.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Yeah. I just think back on my childhood of like, I was definitely bored. Like, I just remember playing outside and being like left alone. And then your imagination kicks in as a kid and like suddenly the flowers are doing this or whatever you might be looking at. Right. And I wonder how much that happens for kids now versus like having to be entertained with like iPads or soccer practice or whatever.
I mean, we're just in the middle of our experiment now. My son we never really had a lot of screen time, but I did notice that like recently, like even on the weekends, it was like a little bit more. And I just started to notice some irritability, whatever. And this summer, starting a week or two ago, like there's not even any screen between Monday and Friday. And between Saturday and Sunday, he has 1 hour.
Yeah.
Unless he's recording music. If he's like recording music on his computer or whatever, that's okay. But like, and you know what? He's figured it out. And like, he doesn't need it. And he's playing with his brother more. And he, it's just, and he's just being okay with like not always having something to do. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Kids don't need to be a part of hustle culture.
It's actually really just not good for them. Like boredom. So you're right. It's where their imagination will get cultivated. And it goes back to the resilience thing, right? It's where they have to like find themselves. I mean, you can't just like be going from one thing to the next. It's like we all have books in the self-help industry about that for ourselves. So imagine what it feels like for the undeveloped brain.
Yeah.
And body.
Yeah. Just stressful and just overload like across the board.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this discussion. I just love talking to you and you're so easy to talk to in general. If people want to try seed or they want to get it for their kids, where can they do that? And for the kids probiotic, is there a certain age range or?
Yeah. So our kids probiotic was studied in children 36 months or older.
Okay.
But actually up to teen can take it. And then, DSO1, which is our adult probiotic, gut for gut microbiome, is, for adults. And then our VSO1, which is our vaginal symbiotic, which for women who are pregnant, postpartum or just experiencing any, vaginal anything, but also proactive vaginal health. That's also for adults as well, or for anyone who's menstruating and above.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay. Thank you so much. I will link all of that in the show notes, and I'll also link your kids' book, so people can also order that and take a look and like read it to their kids at night.
Amazing. I love it. No, well, it was so cool to talk to you, and anything comes up that you need for the show notes, or if you get any questions from your community, please let us know. We love answering them.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to Biohacking with Brittany, where women optimize. If you loved this episode, share it, subscribe, and leave a review to help more women step into science-backed, soul-led wellness. To go deeper, check out the show notes for upcoming retreats, live events, my course, and the latest on socials. Until next time, keep listening to your body, trusting your intuition, and optimizing every step of the way.